Emily Brady. For those who don't know you, I'm director of the Glasscock Center. Welcome to our book chat, our first book chat of this year. And it's lovely to see you all here. We are going to be featuring Dr. Chaitanya Lakkimsetti for this book chat, and her recent book, Legalizing Sex, Sexual Minorities, AIDS, and Citizenship in India, which was published by NYU University Press in 2020. She worked on this book during a faculty research fellowship at the Glasscock Center. Dr. Lakkimsetti is an associate professor in sociology here at Texas A&M University, and her work centers on gender, sexuality, law, and citizenship. In her empirical and theoretical work, she employs transnational and intersectional approaches to study sexual and gender inequalities in a global context. Her book, Legalizing Sex, Sexual Minorities, AIDS, and Citizenship in India, and related articles examine how sexual and gender minorities demand legal and political citizenship in contemporary India. More particularly, she examines how the global HIV/AIDS crisis has transformed the relationship between gender and sexual minorities and the Indian state. She deploys Foucauldian lens of biopolitics and post-colonial understandings of the state to understand these contemporary transformations. Her work brings to light contemporary struggles for social justice undertaken by sex workers and LGBTQ groups in India. In collaboration with her colleague, Dr. Vanita Reddy, who is our respondent today, she is working on a comparative project on the Me Too movements in India and the US, with the goal of the project being to develop comparative frameworks to theorize feminist movements in a transnational context. Our respondent, Dr. Vanita Reddy, in the English department, is a feminist scholar and cultural critic whose research focuses on the intersections of race, sexuality, and gender in global contexts. Dr. Reddy's research focuses on practices of cultural identity, social belonging, and political community within the South Asian American and global South Asian diaspora. It seeks to make visible subjects and populations who have occupied a historically marginal place within studies of diaspora and globalization, such as women, girls, service sector workers, undocumented migrants, and sexual minorities. She is the author of Fashioning Diaspora, Beauty, Femininity, and South Asia American Culture, published in 2016. Our format today is for first, Dr. Lakkimsetti to introduce the themes in her book with a response by Dr. Reddy. We will follow that with Q&A and discussion. And of course, we'll ask the audience to mute their microphones when they're not speaking. And I believe we agreed with Dr. Reddy and Dr. Lakkimsetti that questions would be asked through the raise hand function. We're not a huge group, so you could probably also do that rather than using the chat function. Okay, without further ado, please, Dr. Lakkimsetti.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brady. It's an honor to be here, and it's so great to see my friends and colleagues. I just feel so loved and supported. And special thanks to Glasscock Center for being so supportive of my work. The book, definitely, as Dr. Brady mentioned, part of it was written while I had a research fellowship with Glasscock, and of course, their continuing support to our Me Too project. And I also want to thank Dr. Reddy, who is my friend, collaborator, and mentor. She plays so many roles, and I couldn't have asked for a better respondent for my book. And I look forward to all your questions and comments, and it's just really nice to be done. That's how I want to start. So I have a few slides, and I just, to keep myself in check with time, I just have my notes, and I'll be reading from my notes. So I have a few slides I want to share I might need I would need to share the screen if I could be
I think Amanda has made you a co-host. It should be possible.
Okay, now I can.
Okay, good.
It's this book is been more than a decade in making, but it has been a great journey working on this book, because India has a vibrant sexuality rights movement, especially sex workers and LGBTQI plus groups being at the center of debates about citizenship and rights in contemporary India. The significance of these struggles are also evident through the global visibility that the Indian anti-sodomy law struggles have gained. It has a legal, like a checkered legal history with, in 2009, the New Delhi High Court giving a positive judgment, and when it was challenged in the Supreme Court reversed that decision, and then in 2018 there was a positive decision finally. So it's been a long legal battle around the anti-sodomy law. Similarly, the 2014 decision of the Indian Supreme Court to recognize gender identity as a constitutional right gained global visibility. This decision, unlike some of the moments in the anti-sodomy law struggle, was hailed globally as a very progressive legal reform. So as you can see, there are some contradictory developments, and also rich legal decisions that come out of these struggles. So my book dwells into this rich politics of sexuality at the intersections of public health, law, and social movements, to understand how previously marginalized groups have become visible in the Indian public sphere. So the main question that drives this book is, how are previously marginalized and stigmatized groups able to make claims over the Indian state, and how does the Indian state respond to these demands? One of the main arguments that I make in this book is that because the Indian state is invested in HIV/AIDS programs, and invested in these communities in a different way than it was before HIV/AIDS epidemic. So to be effective, these projects need the engagement of the governed. Here, by governed, I mean sex workers, LGBTQ groups, and this investment of the state also gives space for the governed to make demands on the state. So that's the main argument I make, that to be effective, biopolitical projects need the engagement of the governed, which means that the governed can also make demands on the state. I'm going to touch upon just three, I think, are main interventions of the book. I don't want to speak too long. I want to focus mostly on these three themes that I think are through which the book is mobilized. So the first is a comparative approach that brings together LGBTQKIH. K here is Kothi, and H is Hijra. I can talk more in the Q&As if you want to know more about those categories. These are indigenous sexual and gender categories in India. There are more than these, but I highlight these two categories in the book so that I do not want to privilege LGBTQI only as a site for politics around sexuality in India. So I deploy this comparative approach that brings together LGBTQKIH and sex workers politics in contemporary India. I do this because there's a significant overlap between these struggles in India. Sex workers, gay men, and men who have sex with men, which is a public health terminology, and trans women have been incorporated incorporated into HIV/AIDS programs at different stages of the AIDS policy in India. This incorporation has led to politicization of the communities. This is especially evident from the fact that we see demands for rights-based struggles emerge since the mid-1990s, and these demands intensify by 2000s, mid-1990s is when HIV/AIDS epidemic peaks in India. Western theories of sexuality approaches gay and lesbian struggles and transgender struggles as separate issues, like it's sexuality versus gay identity rights issue. So often gay and lesbian struggles are studied separately, but Indian case shows considerable overlap that cannot be missed. The fight against the colonial era sodomy law is often perceived in media or international press as a fight of gay and lesbians in India. But if one attends to the reality of how this law is applied in India, it has impacted trans communities, especially Hijras, disproportionately. So this binary between gender rights and sexual rights is actually not something that works in Indian context. Similarly, sex work is often seen as an issue of cisgender women, but large number of sexual minorities in India are affected by the presence of prostitution laws and also ideologies and frameworks that stigmatize prostitution as a form of labor. In addition, these three groups also share histories of legal regulations that go back to the colonial British rule. These include regulations of prostitution during the 19th century, during the when the British introduced the Contagious Disease Act to prevent the spread of syphilis and other sexually transmitted infections. And later on, the laws around prostitution have been impacted by global debates around trafficking and fear of white slavery. Anti-sodomy law, which I mentioned before, is a direct British colonial law, which was introduced in India in the 1860s. And it remained in books till 2018 when the Supreme Court finally decriminalized adult consensual homosexual sex. Similarly, trans groups have been impacted by colonial law called the Criminal Tribes Act, which criminalized hijras. And even though that law is not in books, it's still the framework of looking at gender non-conforming people as criminals still operates in local police codes, and also some of these police codes retain these laws. So these colonial regulations are being challenged and contested in the context of globalization, and particularly in the context of global health crisis. That's other common in a comparison, and that when you think of the similarities of these three groups. In addition, state becomes a crucial site for sexual minority struggles. It is either demanding legal reforms or challenging state policy, or building social movements around legal change. So state's still a very rich site for demands by marginalized groups. They haven't abandoned it. They still, it's a very rich site where sexual minority struggles are taking place. This is why this comparative approach is one of the critical interventions of this book. The second intervention is here, I think, I add a layer of analysis to the understanding of biopolitics, not only as producing docile subjects, but also opening space for new political subjectivities. I will say more what I mean by that. So the position I take in the book is that rights-based struggles cannot be separated from health projects and health interventions. Often in literature, these are seen separately, like people who speak about HIV/AIDS only talk about health. people who talk about rights-based struggles of sexual minorities, only focused on law or rights demands of these groups. But my book intervenes in these debates by bringing these two sets of scholarships together. Whereas politics of rights and politics of health are studied separately, I use Foucauldian idea of biopower, that is, modern states need to modern states need to manage populations and hence sexuality to understand how HIV/AIDS projects are generative of subjects, discourses, and new modes of relationality between the state and previously marginalized groups, providing new language of how some of the language that I heard being used during my fieldwork is that we as sexually marginalized group are helping to prevent the AIDS epidemic. We are taking care of the health of the nation. We are invested in the greater good of nation. So there's a new language that the HIV/AIDS epidemic also makes available to previously marginalized groups. Hence the idea HIV is our friend, which is also a title of one of my chapters, which came out of a quote from my fieldwork about how sex workers feel about their involvement in these programs. This quote indicates a new political negotiations and spaces that are open for sexually marginalized groups. The book dwells into HIV/AIDS policies, the initial couple chapters, especially the emphasis on behavioral change that these projects put. And this emphasis requires involvement of at-risk groups. HIV/AIDS in India is not seen as like a gay disease, unlike in the US. It is seen as a disease that affects particular high-risk communities. So these at-risk communities are involved to manage the epidemic at the minutest details. So, peer educators, marginalized groups become peer educators, community mobilizers, and advocates of health, because without their involvement, it would be difficult to also reach populations which are criminalized. That's one of the shifts that happens with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. This was an opportunity for marginalized groups, albeit limited in its scope because of the emphasis on sexual risk. There's definitely a criticism of HIV/AIDS that it is very limited in its emphasis on sexual risk. But still, this was the first time that communities are able to share some kind of a power with the state. Right, that they are going to be involved in these projects, and the state also needs to hear them. When the Indian state was compelled to share power with these marginalized communities, it also opens itself for demands from marginalized groups. Scholars who adopt Foucauldian approaches, ideas of biopolitics, focus more on discipline and regulation, but not so much on resistance, even though resistance is very much part of Foucauldian framework because of his famous formulation, where there is power, there is resistance. The subjects that are produced, as I argue in the book, through these health projects are not just docile subjects. They are also capable of manipulating, negotiating, and resisting power. This was evident to me when I was talking to sex workers and LGBTQI+ groups about what shift they saw with HIV/AIDS. There was a one poignant moment I had in my fieldwork where sex workers said, previously when we used to go to the police station, we would hang our head low, but now we go to the police station with our head held up high. It was also a commentary on the collective strength of their mobilization, because when they say they are proud of going to the police station now, it was also because of this collective strength of their mobilization. So my goal in the first few chapters was to establish the transformative relationship between the state and sexual minorities in the context of the HIV/AIDS. Chapter 2, titled Challenging Bare Life, draws on ethnographic evidence, reports from human rights groups, to argue that in the context of HIV/AIDS, state cannot operate purely through deploying criminal laws and juridical power. This chapter illustrates the tension between juridical and biopower, criminal laws, and health policies, particularly exemplified through the condom wars, where peer educators would go to parks and other hotspots, what they call in the health terminology, to distribute condoms. They always encounter police, and police would arrest them just because they were carrying condoms in their bags. So peer educators carrying condoms became a big political issue. Peer educators carrying condoms were subject to harassment and violence by the police. And several organizations working on HIV/AIDS became targets of violence and harassment. Human Rights Watch, the international human rights group Human Rights Watch, called this an epidemic of abuse. While these incidents brought attention to the challenges that NGOs and communities face in the face of criminal laws, it also brought to light everyday abuse and violence that police inflict on the community. One of the arguments that are made by activist groups is that how are we going to reach out to communities if there are laws that drive these communities underground? So peer educators were on the front lines. Peer educators are all mostly from the communities, bringing this knowledge about the violence that is faced by the communities back to the NGO spaces and into international human rights and national human rights arenas. They questioned the HIV/AIDS programs also for their single-minded focus on health and challenged them to consider stigma and violence experienced by these communities. Sex workers groups mobilized under the platform of HIV/AIDS, mobilized and spoke against police violence and abuse. Similarly, MSM groups and LGBT groups also challenged law, like anti-sodomy law is one good example of how HIV/AIDS platform provided this opportunity to challenge criminal laws. So unlike other scholars who usually think of HIV/AIDS as another way of state gaining power in these communities, I use the analytics of biopolitics here to parse out those aspects of the state that are harmful or more violent, and those that are amenable to demands of marginalized groups. So not thinking of state as a monolith, but as looking at it as more disaggregated, often rift with contradictions. And it is through this disaggregating the state that we can understand the politics of the governed and their struggles to fight violence and arbitrary state power. Third, because of the way I look at state, not as as some kind of a monolithical thing. This is scholarly work that's already done on critical theories of state, drawing from transnational feminist scholars. I understand state as fragmented and rift with internal contradictions. More particularly in the context of transnational governmentality, states' functions are dispersed, and the distinction between state and non-state actors is often hard to make. In India, the HIV/AIDS governance is undertaken through the National AIDS Control Organization, which is a federal organization, national and transnational NGOs, local grassroots organizations, which often produce internal contradictions in the state. The tension between the juridical and biopolitical projects become apparent in the legal struggles that I talk about. So in 2005, there was an attempt to introduce a new amendments to the prostitution laws by bringing in a clause that criminalized clients. Sex workers mobilized against it. They mobilized, they used this rift between the health National AIDS Control Organization, which is responsible for HIV/AIDS prevention, and the Women's Ministry of Women, which is trying to introduce this stringent laws around trafficking. And they use this rift in these two state agencies to temporarily stall the law that was being introduced. And finally, that law lapsed in Parliament, so it wasn't passed. Similarly, in the case of anti-sodomy law, the positions taken by the National AIDS Control Organization was very different from the other state agencies involved in arguing the case in front of the court. So these are some of the contradictions I draw in the book, like showcasing how state agencies are also divided in their positions towards the rights claims of marginalized groups, and how then these fractures and frictions in the state are mobilized by sexually marginalized groups to make their claims. So state response to sexual minority struggles is not always, it doesn't mean that these struggles have always been positive. I mean, I just have a, this is a layout of the book, but just the timeline of various struggles here. You see that since 1994, there has been several struggles happening in the courts, but I don't want to spend too much time dwelling on it. I can talk about some of this later on. I know I'm running out of time, but I just want to highlight that even though I was talking about this different relationship between the state and marginalized groups in this book, it does not mean that the outcomes are predictable. So there has been contradictory and uneven legal gains that sexually marginalized groups have made in India. The 2008 verdict of the Supreme Court declaring Section 377, that's anti-sodomy law, unconstitutional. That's a huge success for sexual minorities. But then this came after a huge and bitter legal struggles. Most recently, trans groups are fighting a bill that the government has passed that undermined a lot of the rights they got in the courts in 2014, and sex workers continue to be bombarded with anti-trafficking agendas that often set them back in their claims for rights. So rights are a contested terrain, and that's although I do dwell a lot on the rights-based struggles, my contention is not that rights are per se the place for where social justice demands are resolved, but it's a contested terrain. And the Indian struggles of sexual minorities underscore that without the active participation of marginalized groups and powerful social movement building, there cannot be positive legal change. So I'll end here, and I will give it to Vanita.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. It's really fun to be able to talk about Chaitanya's book outside of a formal context. I've actually taught this book. I taught it last semester in my Theories of Gender course, and it's just exciting to see it come from where I saw it in, I think, Chaitanya's third year to now. And so it's really awesome to be part of that process. Chaitanya sort of highlighted some of the things I wanted to say, but I'm going to try to focus on some takeaways that you didn't cover, Chaitu, in your comments, that I have found really useful in terms of, so this is more of like how I would approach this text pedagogically. So, when I was teaching it to grad students, and what I find really valuable about the book in terms of, approaching this from sort of like an advanced undergrad or graduate course. It's really accessible. I would highly recommend it if you have a class where you can, where this would fit the framework. It's also not very long, which makes it, I think, really teachable in a graduate seminar. So Chaitu talked a little bit about the role of the state. So one of the major takeaways is the role of the state in advancing sexual minority projects or politics. And she mentioned specifically the way that biopolitical state projects really need the engagement of the governed. So sexual minorities make demands on the state in ways that both advance the state's regulatory functions, certainly, but also condition possibilities for undermining or weakening state power from within. And so I think you really see that sort of tracked through every chapter in the book. The other one is the way that HIV/AIDS kind of organizes the book, right? It's the narrative through line, if I could call it that, in the book. This becomes, HIV/AIDS is really the shared platform for what Chaitanya calls the uneven conditions of livability. This is from page 5 of the introduction, for these sexual minority groups, sex workers, men who have sex with men, and LGBTIQH K groups. So that's the Hijra Koti designation that's particular, right, to the translocal kind of sexual minority populations in India. So again, I think HIV/AIDS, right, is the shared platform for these uneven conditions of livability for these populations. The first couple chapters, I think, do a really good job of showing how before the AIDS crisis of the late 1980s, sexual minorities were not treated as populations or political communities with the moral standing to approach the state with demands to improve their lives. So HIV/AIDS becomes an important analytic because it marks a shift from juridical power to biopower, right? From this repressive form of power, or what Foucault says, power that says no, to biopolitical power, which is about, right, the management of populations, which is decentralized, diffuse, and productive. And again, as Chaitanya already pointed out, HIV/AIDS makes possible new political subjectivities and social movements, hence the phrase HIV is our friend. So I mean, as one example of that. I wanted to just also say that the introduction is really good for introducing undergraduates and graduate students to like really accessible definitions of the distinction between juridical power and biopower. And I know Chaitanya won't take full credit for this, but I'm going to give her full credit anyway for making that distinction really eloquently. It also does a really good job in the introduction of distinguishing between biopolitics and governmentality. So if you're looking for, you know, not only, right, like your interest in kind of sexual economies, right, which is what this book is about in the global South, but really just like a great breakdown of Foucauldian concepts of biopower, I would really recommend the introduction for that, like pages 5 through 11 specifically, which I think do a really good job. It also occurred to me that, you know, I don't think Chaitanya spells this out explicitly, but as I've read and taught this book, one of the other sort of narrative through lines that emerges for me in the book is the tension between this public health discourse around HIV/AIDS and then a kind of public morality discourse that's always bumping up against that discourse. So for me, while HIV/AIDS offers a shared platform for rights-based claims, it's always in the book betraying the way that public morality discourse is haunting this platform. So the way that like, right, and this public morality discourse is leveraged both by the state, but also by activists too. And so I really see those two discourses in tension. And I think I can see that mapped out in every chapter, particularly the one on sex work, but not only the one on sex work. I think Chaitanya already did a really good job of summarizing, you know, the main argument of the book, which is that biopolitical projects need the participation of the governed in order to be effective at managing the life of a population. So we can see this, for example, in the way that the state recruits sex workers as part of their peer education programs, right? And the way that before HIV/AIDS happened, these populations didn't have the moral authority to approach the state. So, right, we can see, I think this is just such a really eloquent and compelling example of what Foucault really means by biopolitics, which is the way that regulation works through shared governance. She already talked about her comparative framework, but that's another takeaway for me. I think it's what makes this book, what probably made this book really hard to write, quite frankly, because it would be so much easier just to study sex workers or right, men who have sex with men, or third gender, right, populations. But instead, Chaitanya makes a really compelling point for why, right, when we take HIV/AIDS as the through line, like why that actually brings together these populations, and sort of demands that they be studied in relation to each other. So I'm not going to say too much more about that because she already sort of covered that territory. I do want to say that maybe two last things. One is that the last two chapters, one of chapters 4 and 5, I really appreciated because they show how these populations' demand for rights are tactical and strategic rather than political ends in themselves. And I think that that's like when we think about, rights-based claims, and I think Chaitanya talks about this in the introduction, that there's been a lot of rightful feminist skepticism around rights qua rights, right? But like, I think what she shows is that these are not endpoints for these groups. These are actually kind of strategies of mobilization. And so, for example, how transgender rights allowed hijras and kotis to appeal to the state to reconsider Section 377 by drawing attention to the contradiction of recognizing identity-based claims, so recognizing third gender, right, as a gender identity, while also criminalizing same-sex sex. So this allows transgender populations to point to how 377 effectively permits the policing of gender identity in the name of criminalizing sex, right? So, or sex acts, which is of course now protected under the 2018 ruling. But I think nonetheless, right, I think thinking about rights as tactical and strategic rather than ends in of themselves is a perfect example of what Chaitanya means when she's talking about how these groups can make demands on the state, right, through state power. The other thing I really appreciated about this book, and maybe I'll end with this, is how, and again, I don't think Chaitanya says this explicitly, but how she understands political effects as very heterogeneous. So, right, we can think about broad-based political coalitions that emerge from non-state actors like NGOs that work as appendages of the state, the way that HIV/AIDS platforms extend beyond health-based rights claims, fractures in state legitimacy. One of my favorite examples is actually the chapter on sex work, where Chaitanya spends a lot of time talking about how sex workers advocated for themselves in a way that stalled amendments from passing in the legislature. So it wasn't necessarily that they were gaining rights, but it's that they were stalling legislation that would hinder their conditions of livability. And so we can think about, right, like how stalling like what the temporality of that is, right? How that in itself is a kind of political effect or political victory. So I think it's, I just appreciate the robust way in which you're thinking about like what counts as a political effect. And I think I'll just end there. I mean, I have other things to say, like what's happening now with the distinction between sexual and gender identities on the one hand and sex acts on the other. You begin the book with this distinction, right? Where I think it was a Hijra protest, right, in Hyderabad, where the Hijra says, yeah, well, the state recognizes my gender, but like, what does that mean if I go have sex in a park, right, with someone? Is somebody going to come arrest me because of same sex, because of 377? So I'm interested in, where we are in India now with this like tension between identity versus acts in terms of sexual minority population. So that's kind of a question. I think I cheated. I'm not allowed to ask questions, but I am interested in knowing, kind of what you think about that. But I'm going to stop there, and maybe we can open it up for questions now.
Yeah, let me maybe just just in case, just offer Chaitanya if she wants to say any quick response or not. We can just open up to questions. It's really up to you.
Thank you so much, Vanita. I mean, my book sounds better when you talk about it than when I talk about it. um, so yeah, in terms of where we are in India with the tension between identity and acts, it's interesting. I mean, when I was writing the book, because the legal struggles are so contemporary, things was changing so fast. When I was actually wrapping up the book, that's when the Supreme Court decision in 2018 came about with regard to the anti-sodomy law. They uh, like declared it unconstitutional. So I had to kind of go and change some of my chapter conclusions. So there wasn't that much time for me to reformulate some of what's happening. But in the end, I speak about how even though trans groups in India have gained gender identity rights, recognition that gender identity as a constitutional right, I think the way in which identity is extrapolated here, and kind of Indian state is strategically deploying it without actually giving them substantive rights. I mentioned that in the end of end of my presentation. The Indian government has introduced a new bill in the parliament, and it was successfully passed, much against the wishes of transgender groups. Some of the critical gains they made in the Supreme Court, that is that they can choose their own self-identity. They don't have to get a medical certificate or go to a doctor or a psychologist to, for somebody to endorse their gender identity. The new bill took away that. They have to go through this bureaucratic process to establish their gender identity. So identity becomes a much more contested terrain now with this new bill. Trans groups are still fighting it. They're in the Supreme Court trying to see if this bill can be defeated. But really, it is still an ongoing struggle in terms of, I mean, the Indian state is celebrating its progressiveness, but there are a lot of stuff that are criminalized in the new bill too, like arms seeking, which is an important part of a livelihood for some of the historical groups like Hijras, who have depended traditionally on begging or arms seeking. That was criminalized in the new bill. So the acts are still continue to criminalize in these ways, even though identities also gets challenged and contested. Acts like begging, and most recently, Indian states also trying to introduce stricter anti-trafficking laws, which will also affect trans groups. So while acts are still being criminalized, I think identities are also being thoroughly politically contested.
Great, thank you.
Great. Okay, I'll hand over to Dr. Reddy, who's going to field questions for us. And again, raise your hand or hand function. Yeah.
Anyone? I have all my participants up, so I should be able to see you if you raise your hand. Yeah, Marnie.
Forgot how to unmute myself, I'm sorry. I had a question about I was just curious, I grew up like just very fascinated with Bollywood. And kind of, I mean, my introduction to it was my mother, and I mean, this might be very incorrect, but it was kind of how she explained it was that it's compared to like Hollywood, it can be a lot more conservative just because of the culture and everything, which I don't even know if that's correct. But I was just kind of curious though, if what the impact of this on Bollywood, or like has Bollywood kind of played a role within this in India, or has it not? Like, I was just kind of curious overall with that. Sorry, that sounded a lot smarter in my head than when I said it out loud.
Yeah, that's a good question. Although, I mean, I do not have any empirical evidence to answer that. My book focuses mostly on the state and law and social movements, but like a very impressionistic my remarks will be impressionistic rather than like research supported by research or empirical facts. I don't think Bollywood had played a big role in the struggles of sexual minorities. You still see you still see LGBTQ groups represented as deviant in Bollywood films. And I think what's interesting is you see much more referencing to LGBTQ identities in Bollywood, but I don't think it's positive. So mostly being ridiculed, or they're really in the margins. Although there are a couple films that came out that are progressive, but it's really, really marginal when compared to the mainstream Bollywood cinema. But I would open it to others if they want to make any comments on Bollywood. Because
I was just going to add that I think also, even when there is queer representation, it tends to be mostly male or masculine. And I would include hijras and kotis within that in a very problematic way, that I'm in the sense that they're male bodied, right? Even if they're feminine presenting. So there's still this large invisibility of the lesbian within mainstream Bollywood cinema. And I think also you do talk a little bit about lesbian groups in your book, but I would say they largely fall outside the gambit of the study as well. So to that extent, I think there's still both possibly cultural representational invisibility, maybe also some degree of political invisibility, or maybe less visibility. Where I've seen lesbian representation is mostly in independent films, in Indian independent films rather than Bollywood.
Yeah, some of the best films are from like Malayalam cinema, independent films. But also within Bollywood, hijras are represented in a very negative light. Again, the colonial understandings of hijras as kidnappers and criminals kind of become very much part of Bollywood's representation as well. But with regard to Vanita's question about lesbians missing in this book, it's a very important point, because again, they're missing in the HIV/AIDS framework because they are not seen as high-risk groups. So there is definitely an exclusion, right? So trans men are not included. Lesbians are not included within this health framework. But what is important, I think I mentioned this in the sodomy law struggles, is that queer women and feminist groups have been very much involved in the fight against the anti-sodomy law. Although it's seen as a law that affecting gay men, it's queer women and feminist groups have really been very actively involved in the fight against the anti-sodomy law. So the legal side and the health sides definitely erase the experiences of queer women and trans men, but they emerge again in these political sites, social movements, and in the collective struggles where their voice is, they are fighting to include their voices, right? It's also it's similar to the US too, right? How white male gay men's experiences are centered in the LGBTQ movement. Similarly, middle class gay Indian men, upper caste Indian gay men's experiences are being centered within the LGBTQ movement as well. And then the queer women and trans men's voices and trans women and hijra voices disrupt the centering of middle class Indian gay men as the voice of the LGBTQ movement. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and also, I mean, with just like with the US, I mean, lesbians were political actors in fighting HIV/AIDS, even if they weren't, right, the recipients of those particular forms of recognition. Yeah. So Soy has her hand up, so I'm gonna let her ask the next question.
We can't hear you. So.
Oh, sorry. Okay. First of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation. What I found really inspiring was how you took a Foucauldian approach to combining the health discourses and the rights discourses. Honestly, I haven't read the book, but I really look forward to reading your book. I have a question about your research, or to be specific, your experience during your research. You research individuals and groups who are considered sexual minorities in India, which is a very diverse and wide range groups of LGBTQI. I forgot. What I had a question was, did you notice any intra-group conflicts, especially with the political moves that they all take? And what did you find most difficult when you were researching the wide range of groups and dealing with all the different political agendas that they take?
That's a great question. I mean, this doesn't come out in the book because my focus is on the state and social movements and law. I touch upon that a little bit when I talk about anti-sodomy struggles. So there's a huge debate within the LGBTQIKH groups in India whether anti-sodomy law should be even the center of the struggle for LGBT rights. Should it even be the starting point? Who does it include? Who does it exclude? So there's been a vibrant debate about whether anti-sodomy law should be the central focus of these struggles. And within those debates, I have often heard transphobia by within lesbian and gay and queer groups. Several Hijra and Khotis groups have talked about how they are mobilized only to protest on the streets, but when it comes to fancy parties, they're excluded because of the transphobia within the communities. So there is definitely there are issues of class, language, English speaking, gay and lesbian groups versus more working class, people who are vernacular, who speak vernacular languages. So class, language divisions, and they are really part of. They come up, but despite all of that, despite also some of the disagreements about whether sodomy law should be the central focus of the movement, they still, sodomy law struggles galvanize LGBTQ groups of different class, language, and regional regional focus. So I think that it's also because of the state, right? The law and how the so in 2009, when the New Delhi High Court for the first time declared anti-sodomy law unconstitutional, that's when the LGBTQ movement got mobilized. And then again in 2013, when the Supreme Court reversed that, again there were these bursts and moments of energy and momentum that brought people together despite their differences to fight against the law. So I don't dwell much into those complexities among these various groups, but there are also discussions about like queer pride marches where HIV/AIDS centered groups wanted to distribute condoms, and more radical oriented queer activists saying that's promoting state agendas, we shouldn't do it. So there are tensions like that that appear as well as any other political movements, as tensions appear in other political movements as well. I think that will be another rich book to write about LGBT, focusing on these politics, and also regional variations too, like South India, much more focused on caste as well versus North India. So it's a really, in that sense, a very dynamic and rich terrain to observe. So thank you.
So we only have a few minutes left. I don't see any virtual hand raises. Does anybody want to ask a final question in our last few minutes?
I know it's like kind of probably really difficult because I mean, that's kind of the central thing, but could you expand a little bit more on the K and the H within the LGBTQ? I know that's like difficult to do with the limit.
No, thank you. Thank you for asking. So K here refers to Kothi. Kothis are, Kothi identities differ, but just to give you a very bare bones definition is they were born as men, but they identify as they identify with their femininity, and they have sexual relationships with heterosexual men. So they are, again, hijras are often seen as a third gender, but an anthropologist, Gayatri Reddy, she talks about how thirdness in India is also like, it's not one category, it's like a whole different categories that fit into that thirdness. We often club all this into thirdness. Often, the boundaries between Kothi and Hijra are transparent. You could be a Hijra living within a Kothi house, Kothi living in a Hijra household, and later in a few years becoming Hijra. So there is a very organic relationship between these groups. The Hijras are supposed, they are often popularly talked as the third gender in India, but they are one of the most visible trans groups in India. Within what happens within the HIV/AIDS framework is that Hijras are seen as gender minorities, Kothis are seen as sexual minorities. So there is again there is a neat separation that happens within the global health discourses. But there is a much more organic relationship between these communities. Because of the historical presence of Hijras in Indian history and culture, and often Hijras also occupy like very marginal spaces, like they have households and kinship practices that are completely outside the heteronormative structures. Like they live in what is called gharanas, like kinship spaces, where the elderly Hijra will be the mother or grandmother with disciples and daughters and sisters. So they all live in a household. It's also an economic unit. Some of the younger Hijras, they go and beg, and there also this practice of Tholi Badai, which is different in different parts of India, but especially in North India, because hijras are seen as also, despite their, it's an interesting contradiction. They're stigmatized, but they're also seen as auspicious at the same time. So hijras, because of their supposedly third, because of not being men or women, they're supposed to be having this power to bless married couple, bless them, and this blessing is seen as offering fertility to this couple, bless when the children are born. So it's called Tholi Badai. So earning a livelihood through that. So these homes, the ghranas are also like economic units of their own, especially when families are disowning children. If they are gender non-conforming, they come and live in the hijra household. They find hijra households and live with them. So they also become the the alternate space, like where gender non-conforming children, adults and individuals are taken in when the mainstream society disowns them. So there's a lot more complexity to this, but that's maybe a simple answer to your question.
I saw Dinah's hand up, but then I think she put it down. I think in realizing we were maybe out of time.
Yeah, no, I don't. It took me a long time on a different device. It took me a long time to figure out how to raise my hand. So sorry, we ran out of time.
Okay. So Emily, I guess I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for a really wonderful discussion, and so exciting to hear about your book. I knew something about it already when we talked about it, but we'd intended to have this last spring. It was such a shame because the timing meant we had to postpone it, but I'm so glad to see some new energy really, around the book and the discussion here. And so thank you again, and thank you everyone for feeding back, and both to Dr. Lakkimsetti and also to Dr. Reddy for leading us through such an interesting topic and research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
All right. Well, I think we'll unfortunately say goodbye for now, but yeah, we'll look forward to hearing more from everyone about their research in our book chat series. So thank you. Thank you again, everyone.